What can we do when life seems to lose its footing? What can we do when we are faced with our own death, our mortality, the limitations of time? How to find footing in the midst of turmoil, inner turmoil, is the topic for our time together today. Spiritual stories across the ages about a raging sea that calms are powerful images for the process of finding our peace. Greetings and welcome to this lecture series on a revolutionary new way of reading the Bible by Eugen Drewermann, an internationally best-selling author of more than 100 books, including a book on The Little Prince that has been translated into a dozen languages, a bestseller on analyzing clergy mentality that helps us understand how clergy often struggle and also sheds light on the clergy abuse scandal. But most of all, books about our deepest questions as humans. There's also a book on Herman Melville's Moby Dick, and many interpretations of biblical stories in a refreshing way that does not feel stale, that does not feel moralizing, but that instead helps us be able to use these stories as guideposts for a life that is grounded. Drewermann uses insights from psychology, philosophy, poetry, and the sciences to help us read biblical stories and stories in other religious traditions, other spiritual traditions, as stories of our own lives. If this is your first time, you can find previous lectures in a playlist on this channel, the Drewermann channel, that's how his name is pronounced in German. If you subscribe to this channel, you will get notified of future lectures and other videos. Today, we will look at two stories in the Gospel of Mark about being on high sea while a storm is raging. The two stories portray the process of the calming of the storm differently. In one, everyone is in the boat. In the other, only those who were following with Jesus, the so-called disciples, are in the boat, and Jesus is coming down from a mountain where he had been alone by himself, and then is walking toward them on the water. Now, as you hear that, try not to think of this as a magical story. This is not a magical story about literally walking on water. You may just want to try that on your own. Even if you pray as hard as you want, you will not be able to walk on water physically. And this is not actually what this story was ever meant to talk about. It was never meant to be about physically walking on water. That is actually something that creates superstition. And it also creates a God image that seems very capricious and arbitrary and has done things in the long distant past, but doesn't do them like this anymore. So those who claim they interpret the Bible, quote, literally, or as it was meant to be read, in this literal, physicalistic, biologistic sense, they forget that religious stories are always symbolic stories. because they're about our life as a whole, not about some magical trick that happened randomly somewhere in the distant past, or that is only given to some special people. No. Drewermann helps us understand the significance of stories like these, so that we today can have the very life-altering experiences that first led to the creation of these stories. I will read first the translation of the text, of the biblical text, based on my own translation from the German, of Drewermann's translation from the Greek of these texts. And then I will read the refreshing, life-altering, hopefully, interpretations of these stories by Eugen Drewermann. So let us begin. We will start with the first story of the calming of the storming of the sea, and then we will look at the second one that involves the walking on water. So the first story of the storm on the sea is found in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. And the interpretation that I'm going to read to you now is from this book. It's in German, the Gospel of Mark, part 1, Images of Redemption. And I'm in the process of translating this book. And the plan is to have this published in the next couple of years. So look out for that. And if you like it, if you like what you hear, like this video and follow the other lectures and look for the book coming out at some point. So chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. And on that day, when it was late, he says to them, "Let us pass over to the other side." Then they dismissed the crowd and took him, as he was, with them in the boat. Other boats were also with him. Then a strong storm wind rises, and the waves hit the boat, so that the boat was already being filled up. But he himself was sleeping in the stern on the pillow. Then they wake him up and tell him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Silence, be still." Then the wind died down, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "What cowards are you? Do you still have no trust?" Then they got afraid, very afraid, and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Depending on one's attitude and one's view of piety, a miracle narrative like this one, of the calming of the storm on the sea, will be perceived very differently. There's what we might call the material and concrete view, and then there is the more symbolic and mystical view of interpreting the world and the events in it. If one wants to understand the present narrative concretely, then the storm and its calming is not quite as wonderful and peculiar as it might seem at first glance, though the story would even then still have to tell us much. The Sea of Galilee lies very low, more than 200 meters below sea level, and is surrounded by the high mountain flanks of the foothills of Mount Lebanon and the Golan Heights. To this day, Arabs call this usually calm and quiet lake Ayin Allah, the eye of God. Nevertheless, the image can also be misleading. After warm and pleasant days, downdrafts can suddenly break into low-pressure areas of the basin. They then hit the water surface almost vertically, whipping up the waves, making it extremely difficult for a boat to maneuver to safety in the confusion of the surging waves. Just as quickly as the tempest appears, it fades away. And quickly the lake lies again calmly and peacefully there, as if it could literally cloud no water. The external course of an event, such as Mark reports here, must have been something like this, or similar to it. A miracle for people in distress, but a normal, natural event, so to speak, for the external observer. But what does such a story tell us about God? If we take the text in an external way, then it is about the fact that we certainly will be torn again and again in our lives between fortune and misfortune, between lucky destiny and fateful breakdowns. In one case, we will thank God on our knees that we were able to escape misery and to make it once more. In the other case, we will cry out in distress and reproach God for sleeping idly instead of caring for our distress. And we will try to awaken God with the cries of our anguish and suffering. In both cases, however, God stands before us, incomprehensible as well as omnipotent, a God who is to be feared as much as to be thanked, a God who is in either case an aloof stranger to us. In this view, we are and remain, for better or worse, at the mercy of such a God. And everything he does, even if it is to our advantage, remains ambivalent to us. The question is always, how will this same God appear in the next moment? Moreover, is it even possible to equate the blind action of nature with the idea of a God who acts in a planful manner? Nature does many things that God does not want. The sea, for example, advances in warm periods and floods land such as wide swath of the North Frisian marshlands in the Grotte Mandrenke storm of 1362, where the legendary town of Rungold sinks forever, and the thought of guilt and punishment inevitably clings to the place and the people of such misfortune. This storm of 1362 flooded large portions of those islands, killed over 25,000 people, and left the water the way it was, covering land. for the most part. But there's no God who wanted the flood. At best, one can say that God created the world in such a way that it is arranged as a whole in the wisest and the best manner, including all the catastrophes which belong to it. Drewermann here quotes the idea of Leibniz of the best possible world that is often used in so-called theodicy discussions, the questions of why do bad things happen to good people, or basically why does God let suffering happen? So in this external view of the world, these are the questions that come up around the question of God. At this point, at last, we realize that it is inevitable to understand our life as a whole, but also all events in it, the terrible as well as the wonderful ones, a bit more inwardly, and to turn them into the symbolic in order to come closer to ourselves and to God. The early church, at least beginning with the Gospel of John, already saw the sea not simply as a specific place in Galilee, but as a symbol for the situation of our life as such. Sea is, in this sense, an image for the abyss, for the groundless tossing to and fro, an image in which all of life appears like a gaping mouth of chaos, which can open at any time under our feet. From a psychological perspective, our own heart is like an infinitely stretching sea that can either carry us or swallow us up, a place of the unconscious, of the unfathomable, of the utterly boundless. We can never avoid getting involved in these waters. The only question is how we live with them. The invitation of this narrative seems to be that we should not only turn to God in prayer for rescue when we are in need, but that above all we should adopt in ourselves the attitude that is itself embodied in Jesus in this story. Sometimes, just when the noise and the hustle and bustle all around us are gone, when the crowd has left and the silence sets in, an inner storm breaks loose. Often enough, just as we leave behind the busyness outside, our hearts begin to roar like an ocean, whipped by wind. We then become afraid of ourselves, unable to find our way. And we look for ways to protect ourselves without knowing how, as if we were caught in the vortex of a maelstrom that is drawing us inexorably into the depth in ever faster circles. Already when dealing with ourselves, it is psychologically extremely important that in hours such as those, we do not let anxiety become omnipotent. Nothing in us lives and no part of the creation exists least of all in our own soul, which we would have to fear as something utterly sinister and destructive. If we try, similar to the figure of Jesus sleeping in the boat, to come more deeply to rest inwardly, then the waves will subside and the wind will calm down. Time and again, when people feel threatened by the unleashed forces of their own deeper psyche, they cry out for help and ask for advice on what to do about the danger. With good reason, the instruction of this gospel story is: basically, there is nothing to do. What is essential in life is to learn how to find peace in the midst of the storm. It is important to anchor the bark of our life more deeply and to trust to the point where below the rolling sea, even more deeply than the abyss, there is solid ground that gives us support. What matters is to reach beyond the zone of psychological anxiety, the place where the storm calms down and we command the wind and the waves. What determines the nature of our sensations, our perceptions, our whole psychological experience is whether there is such a ground below the abyss in our life or not. The attempt to interpret the Bible in terms of depth psychology has repeatedly been accused of psychologizing faith and of indirectly denying that there is such a thing as transcendence beyond the psychological. Nothing could be further from the truth. On the contrary, in this example of the calming of the storm on the sea, depth psychology helps us first to understand what anxieties can afflict people when they are definitely and inevitably confronted with themselves. One enters a zone that one has never entered before. And just in that moment, out of the silence, it bursts forth as if the devil spooked one. One no longer understands oneself and the world. One could only scream with fear, and yet there is no help. All the unconscious, long suppressed, never appreciated forces of the psyche begin to stir in the depth and threaten to swallow up our ego. What can we do then, if not the only thing that Jesus' attitude and depth psychology too can recommend? To rest and to forget the fear in order to regain in the depth, in the speaking of dreams, in the images of sleep, a new strength. Depth psychology in particular can show us that people experience the whole world all the way into their dreams differently, depending on whether or not there's another shore for them beyond the sea of the unconscious. In the end, it is lack of faith, and anxiety that decide how much the sea rages and roars within us. And it is faith and trust alone that are able to stop the storm winds. Depth psychology does not make faith superfluous. On the contrary, it shows how absolutely necessary, and here the German word is notwendig, which is a play on not, which means distress, and wendig, turning, so it's literally that it's absolutely misery turning. So on the contrary, it shows how absolutely misery turning faith is. This is even more true for the anxieties that we do and inevitably must have, not only psychologically, but in a certain sense, metaphysically. Sea stands not only for the abyss of the psyche, but deeper still for the abyss of life, for the gaping nothingness above which our existence lies in its frailty, mortality, and groundlessness. Inevitably, the moment will come one day when no doctor, no priest, no wise counsel, and no intervention from outside will be able to help us, where we will have reached the limits of our earthly existence and where only death still awaits us. It is then basically important, one last time, to find calmness against anxiety. It is then even more decisive to anchor oneself in God and to learn to sleep in the middle of the storm. Death, too, is not our enemy. Death is the sibling of sleep, the beginning of eternity. There are forms of rescue that can no longer be visible in earthly life, but which are valid in eternity. We all are the closer to them, the less we allow the peace of our hearts in God be robbed from us. It is the most important art and the real miracle of our existence, not to lose this peace, this calmness in the midst of anxiety, no matter how stormy it is around us. The fact that things then calm down around us is indeed often no longer as wonderful as it seems at first. The dangers of life that come from outside may disappear just as suddenly as they arrived. We usually have only an indirect influence on them. But what is going on in ourselves and how we relate to God is what determines our entire life. This is our existence. The whole world is full of miracles at every moment because God never leaves us. God is always near us, not only when we call God. And here you have to remember what I've said in previous lectures, that for Drewermann, God is not this ambivalent figure that we have created in our heads through countless indoctrinations. God is ultimate love. God is the word we have for the trust that there's more to us than death. God is this absolute love that gives us life at any moment, even in death. And that is the meaning of Easter we have just celebrated. When it counts, it is not a spectacular external intervention of the kind of the God in the stage machinery of the theater of the Baroque era, the so-called Deus ex machina. What saves us and lets us live is day by day the quiet faith in the constant presence of God, who calms the storm and brings our ship closer to the other shore. This was the first story of the storming of the sea in the Gospel of Mark here that Drewermann interprets in Mark 4. And now we're going to the second story, which is found in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verses 45 to 56. Jesus meets the disciples on the sea. And immediately he urged his disciples to get into the boat and go ahead to the other side toward Bethsaida, while he himself dismissed the crowd. Just a little backdrop here. Before this, there was the so-called miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. And this story happens after this. And so this is the context in which this first verse happened, with this large crowd. After saying farewell to them, he, Jesus, went up on the mountain to pray. But when evening came, the boat was still in the middle of the sea, and he himself was alone on land. And as he sees how they strain themselves rowing, for the wind was against them, he comes toward them at the fourth night watch, walking on the sea, and wanting to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, because everyone was startled at the sight of him. But immediately he spoke with them and tells them, "Have courage, I am. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind calmed down, and they were beyond measure completely besides themselves, because they had not gained insight based on the loaves of bread. Rather, their heart was hardened. So when they crossed over to the land, they came to Gennesaret and docked. But as soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized him and ran throughout the region and began to carry those who were sick around on beds to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he entered into villages, towns, and farms, they laid down the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might at least touch the hem of his cloak. And whoever touched him was healed. Hardly any narrative in Mark's Gospel asks in such a concentrated images, hardly any other narrative in Mark's Gospel asks in such concentrated images what actually sustains us as human beings. It is preceded by the scene of the multiplication of the loaves of bread. 5,000 people who enthusiastically cheer for Jesus. Should we in the church ever be granted to win a similar storm of applause to what is given to Jesus and the crowd of disciples at this moment, we can almost foresee what will happen, how every effort and thought will be put into organizing this success and making the crowd's frenzy of applause continue. It is outright a shock when Jesus at once does exactly the opposite, and does so even with force and in haste. At this moment, when he could let himself be swept away by the surge of enthusiasm, it seems to him rather as if he had to avert a danger of life and death from himself. There's probably no other way to explain this intense staggering of events, or stacking of events. And immediately he forced his disciples to get into the boat and cross over to Bethsaida, while he himself wanted to dismiss the crowd. Apparently, the crowd must be sent away, because it is not about them. The question is rather out of what one can really live. And all ambiguities of false security must be cleared away. What emerges instead is this image of Jesus walking on the sea, born from the vision of solitary prayer on the mountain during long hours of the night. All symbols of the New Testament can be misunderstood in an external way. Some time ago, after a lecture, a Catholic clergyman came to me and asked, "What do you think of the miracles of Jesus?" I said, "I believe in the miracles of Jesus. Isn't the world full of them?" "That is not what I wanted to know. Do you believe, for instance, in Jesus walking on water?" "Most certainly. I believe in Jesus walking on water." "No," he replied. "I'm not sure about what you mean. Do you mean that symbolically or really?" I replied, "I believe symbolic reality is the only real reality." "So then you don't believe," he said. The question is indeed, what do we really believe in? In April 1945, for example, 12,000 people were crammed together in the ship William Gustloff on the Baltic Sea, as the ship was sunk by Russian torpedoes. The same fate met around the same time 7,000 people on the Goya, 3,000 people on the General von Steuben, and we could continue the list without end. What should we learn from this? Christianity would be nonsensical if it consisted in the belief that if God would only want, then God would spare us such forms of death. And that God would, if only we pray trustingly enough, let us walk across the water to safety, even when faced with Russian torpedoes. If there is anything to be learned from catastrophes of such magnitude, it is the insight that the world itself is an abyss, and that there is ultimately no rescue from death, no matter in what form it comes to us. To deepen the feeling for this truth, walk on a summer day along a beach. Each tide washes ashore living creatures in such abundance as if the sea had become weary of them, spewing them out after oversaturation. Nature has no reason to treat us humans differently. She's indeed our mother, but we are only her accidental children. This impression of external nature already resembles an abyss under our feet. Even worse, however, it is with our inner nature, our human heart. Far more than nature outside, it can resemble an open maw. And human hate that whips up the fury of war, for example, can be more terrible and icier than the waves of the Baltic Sea. And we are witnessing this right now in the Ukraine. And we have witnessed this in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and many other countries. How does one protect oneself from such forms of the abyss, from such insights of despair, from such challenges to all of existence? That is the decisive question of our life. So what you're hearing in here is also how we can deal with the way the fears of the abyss whip up wars. That's at stake on some level in how we deal with the abyss in our heart. I continue. Usually we avoid looking at problems of this sort. Against the sea, we build dikes. Against anxiety, we seem to secure ourselves most easily by setting barriers of thinking against the inkling of infinity, the knowledge about the abyss. If one talks to people about the boundlessness of the cosmos, about the enormous dimensions of nature, it will surely soon spread fear and terror. Or if one speaks about the vast expanse of time that was necessary to bring forth our human species, such a subject also goes far beyond our comprehension. One wants to crawl quickly back behind the dikes and calm down in the narrow confines of our everyday existence. But what then becomes of the inkling of infinity? Of course, one can reduce human life to the few years that make up our earthly existence. But will this make our lives calmer, as it should? Quite the opposite. One then clings only the more frantically with the energy of the infinite that lies in our heart to these few decades of earthly life. And this senseless struggle against death turns the interior of our soul into a battlefield of cruelty and unreasonableness. True, we can protect ourselves even against the abyss of the heart, human heart, in a supposedly simple manner. We can seal ourselves off from any true lively energy by means of certain statutes, commandments, and directives. This is, by the way, a mechanism that is very apropos right now here in the United States from where I'm giving this lecture. There are lots of laws that are being passed right now in state legislatures that are really aimed at stemming the lively energy of people's real freedom and really of their depth, be it around, and they often are focused around sexual matters. There are many examples that we can think of here. To go back to the text here, we can desperately, one can avoid, actually, I want to read this sentence again before I inserted an example from our current time. We can seal ourselves off from any true lively energy by means of certain statutes, commandments, and directives. One can avoid any real passion by reverting to being an average citizen. We can desperately try to avoid any intense energy of depth until our life becomes ever narrower. About 140 years ago, Theodore Fontaine described in his novels what happens to our life when we dike it in this way against the sea, against the deep, against the tide. Fontane, for instance, had a story that Drewermann quotes here about an adulteress who is in a loveless marriage and finally experiences the livelihood of love again and finds love outside of marriage. Those are storms that we get afraid of and quickly put moralistic patterns on top of it. Psychotherapy often opts to listen to it, no matter what one will do with it. I continue. Eventually, it becomes a life organized to the last detail, according to the ideas of and Drewermann uses Prussian here, you could say Indiana, or you could say German, or you could say South African or Brazilian, or whichever country you want to put in here. So eventually, it becomes a life organized to the last detail according to the ideas of the Prussian code of law, the Prussian moral view, the Prussian virtues, because those were the ones that Fontana lived under, with no room for exceptions or deviations. A life threatened by only one thing: love. In such a life, one can be hypocritical. One can become psychologically impoverished. One can get sick from it. One can shoot oneself. The system tolerates all of that. The only thing it does not tolerate is love. It does not tolerate happiness, not the vastness of the heart, the freedom of the soul. Instead, one sits trapped together in the boat like prisoners in a galley. In the end, the very thing that could save us becomes a nightmare at midnight. What meets us from the other shore seems like a ghost that makes us scream out in fear precisely because it comes from the sphere that we fear the most, although it is the only one that can save us: infinity. In reality, there's only one way to protect ourselves from the abyss of life. And it is described in a symbolic and exemplary way in the story of Jesus walking on the sea. It is necessary to abandon precisely the supposed safeguards against the infinite and to dare to live our lives, letting go of the everyday system of fictitious securities is not as hard as it seems at first. One needs to discover something in the image of this story of Jesus walking on the sea. Namely, the thing we fear most is often the thing we actually hope for most. What we often fear, like a nightmare, often turns out to be, after the fear is gone, as the content of long-concealed dreams of what we long for. Much lives in our soul that we encounter again after years of repression in nights of fear and restlessness. And as much as we might want to turn, as much as we might want to run from all of that, in it lives something more important than anything else that comes to us, as in the story of the Gospel of Mark, from the other shore, as a condensed dream of our longing for eternity above the abyss of anxiety. Even if this figure of our hope seems to us at first like a spook, like a ghost, it is nevertheless necessary to listen to the voice that says to us, against the power of the storm and against the whirlpool of anxiety, do not be afraid. I am. Be confident. For this voice to be credible, it shows itself through a name, I am, which lives as an essence in us. And it is this name that truly means us, that is eternally connected in the imagination of faith with the person of Jesus. In him lived all the hopes that we, tossed about by waves and surges, have to consider to be quite utopian, a message really from another world. And yet, the miracle of Jesus walking on the sea continues symbolically only what was already experienced in the sign of the multiplication of the loaves of bread. Namely, the worries about the preservation of the earthly existence must not have the last word in our lives. This is the experience that Jesus must have had while praying on the mountain for 4 long night watches, while it was dark and the disciples were at sea. Namely, that what people are worried and scared about in reality does not count. That dream-like one can walk over the worries that people typically create. Not as if the element of fear, as if the abyss would be ignored or not taken into account. Rather, now the distress and the fear turn out to be something that one can transcend without inwardly being threatened by it, because there is another principle that sustains us. All of life on earth resembles in its mortality a storm-lashed sea, which sooner or later pulls down every ship into the abyss. The question, however, is not how we are saved from natural death. The only question is how we learn to live in such a way that we literally walk over the fear of death and, symbolically speaking, walk over the waters of death. Crucial, however, is that we believe what we cannot see. but which plays the most important role in the story of Jesus walking on water. Namely, that Jesus sees the distress of his disciples from the mountain of prayer. We can fight against the storm and the waves as bravely as we like. But what really sustains us is solely this feeling that for the disciples is condensed in the person of Jesus, which is that before God, we are safely enclosed in his prayer, and that in all that we are and do, we can never fall out of God's hand. Only through such trust that despite all hardship, we do not sit alone in the boat and are not tossed to and fro amidst the waves of the sea without notice, does the swell of the sea calm down and the storm subside. From the experiences that one could make with Jesus, one can learn that it is not worthwhile to protect oneself from any part of reality. There is this wonderful power in our hearts that overcomes the fear of our life, the power of trust and faith that loves, the power of trust and faith that love gifts us with. It is once and for all no longer necessary to insure ourselves against the anxiety of life by living less and by existing more and more isolated and diked in for fear of the sea in our heart. The mystery of Jesus walking on the sea is that we ourselves endure in the few years of our earthly existence only if we allow ourselves to be carried by eternity, by the boundless, through the stream of time. The true miracle of our life is an encounter that carries us beyond the finite into the infinite. The moment Jesus enters the boat, the wind calms down. And then there's no longer a boundary between this world and the next, between life in time and life in eternity. There's only this one form to really be, in truth and in love. But this miracle happens in our life again and again, without us noticing it. Ships may sink, and people may die, but truth and love will never die. We humans are called to be eternal. Only through such trust does the world cease being a huge devouring mouth. Only in such faith does the sea of life lose its terror. Only in such confidence does our life gain endurance, ground, and direction. Not without intention does Mark add what then happened in Gennesaret on land. It is as if he wanted to vary again the image of Jesus' walk on the sea by describing how all the sick came or were brought to Jesus immediately so that they could at least touch the hem of his garment. It is indeed true. In the midst of the storms of life, driven by all sorts of currents and waves, accompanied often by feverish dreams of anxiety to the point of illness and madness, it is enough to catch even a glimpse of the life of Jesus. If we grasp even only a little of what he was when he crossed the waters of death before the eyes of his disciples, it will envelop our life with a mantle of trust and security so that it heals us and makes us feel well. In every anxiety, this call of Jesus in the middle of the sea holds true. I am, just believe. A Russian icon of St. Nicholas illustrates, in the context of the same symbolism as Mark's account of Jesus walking the sea, the truth of this mythical or legendary motif of rescue from an existence of anxiety through faith. This is an image that Drewermann has in this book, and I'm going to, let me see if I can show this to you. Maybe this way. He interprets it here. It shows people huddled close together, looking anxious, holding onto their coats. Their little ship is surrounded by waves whose billows rise up like heads of dragons, heads on the sides of the ship. But the figure of the saint is in the boat with them, and his presence has the effect that the raging waves and the roaring of the storm are lost in the distance. Around the boat, however, spreads out a bell-shaped zone without threat, like a protective wall which closes off the tide below, gives shelter above, and already makes the anxious contortions in the retreat in the coats superfluous. Like the color of meadows on land, this space of protection near the person of God is green, so that whoever contemplates it, whoever contemplates this icon, hears as if from afar, through the roar of the waves, once more the words of Jesus to his disciples in the boat. Be confident. I am. Do not be afraid. This brings us to the end of our lecture for today. I hope you have enjoyed it. Feel free to share it and tune in again next week, Friday. I wish you a week in which you can feel, beneath the uncertainties of life, a solid support that holds you and that never disappears. Thank you for listening. See you next week. Bye-bye.